Okay, so right before this, you watched a lecture that Rachel, Svetlana, and Josie helped me create that covered a lot of the kind of aspects of listening in a second language that we now know through second language acquisition research. I wanted to add on a few things that I didn't have a chance to express in that particular lecture. That are pretty important for you to know. So we talked about lots of different aspects around what makes one listener in a second language slightly different than another. We also started to talk about what can make an actual task more difficult or more easy. We talked about speed. And I also wanted to talk about understanding the pragmatics of a situation. So one thing that's really important for us to think about with listening is understanding the sociolinguistic competency that's involved. A really kind of an easy bite-sized piece to kind of understand this is if someone says to you, "Can you close the door? Can you close the door?" And technically, on the surface level, what does that question mean? Do you have the ability to close the door? So someone who has been working on their listening in English might simply answer yes and then remain sitting. But if another listener has either figured out through context what the sociolinguistics are, or who has an instructor who's helped them understand how sociolinguistic competency works in listening and speaking in English, they would recognize that when someone says, "Can you close the door?" it's actually a request. It's not asking if you have the physical ability to close the door. So one thing for us to think about, it's quite important, is when we put a listening and task in front of our students to make sure that their sociolinguistic competency is fully supported. What's the purpose of the thing that's being said to them? What is the person who's speaking attempting to do or attempting to get them to do? What kinds of language can they expect to hear because of how formal or informal it is, or what the topic is, that kind of thing. So just really want to underscore sociolinguistics. It's kind of invisible, but it's pretty important again, and that's kind of a resounding theme I think throughout the ESLG program, is how important that is for our learners to understand what the purpose of something is and to understand what someone is trying to accomplish with it. So some other things that I wanted to mention that are quite important for our English language learners are having background knowledge about the topic. For an English language learner who has a lot of background knowledge about a topic, either because of their experiences in their previous life, in their first language, or because they have an instructor who has either built up that background knowledge for them or reminded them of what they already know about the topic, they are going to be far more successful in listening and understanding the task. And so we really need to underscore how important that is. So we've talked about top-down processing, we've talked about bottom-up processing, and so getting students to access what they already know or filling in those gaps yourself by building up their background knowledge, that's a great example of top-down processing, so very, very important. Another thing to think about is the length of the listening task. And I'm very sensitive to this in my Spanish. I notice that if I'm listening to something, like for example, if I'm listening to a podcast in Spanish, the first 3 minutes, I am so fresh, I am so focused, I am grabbing all the individual words that I can understand, I'm making meaning out of it. After about 10 minutes, I'm starting to flag. And after about 40, I'm really, really exhausted. And so one thing to keep in mind is that listening in a second language or a foreign language is quite exhausting for students. That doesn't mean don't do it. It just means being really sensitive to there is going to be exhaustion in the room if you're doing a listening task for very long. Even if students are choosing, like me, choosing to listen to podcasts in Spanish on my own, no one's assigning me to do it. You can get quite exhausted. So something to think about. And just like we talked about with reading, that there's intensive and extensive reading, the same is true for listening. There's intensive listening, the kind of listening task, fairly short usually, that you would have your students do together in class. You would be scaffolding for them. It would look like, just like with reading, it might look like you're doing 3 pre-listening activities. You're having them listen multiple times, because if you're doing intensive listening in class, that means it's probably at least 1 step above where they are, so that I+1. And so you would be having them listen multiple times. We often have students listen 3 times, just as we have students read text 3 times. And then you would be supporting them as they're listening. Maybe the first time they're listening just for the answer to a question. The second time you have them listening, maybe you say, now that we know what the main idea is, the speaker makes 3 points to try to persuade us of this. Take notes and try to figure out what are those 3 things. Or it might be something else that you have them listening for. Maybe it's a persuasive speech, and one of the ways it's persuasive is because of the vocabulary that are used, that are really strong and very successfully persuasive. So maybe the second or third time you have the students listening for what are those vocabulary, and they're writing them down as they listen in some way. So there's intensive listening, and I just walked you through what that might look like. And then there's extensive as well. And extensive listening is, there are longer periods of time. They tend to be at or below where the student is naturally in their language proficiency. And it tends to be with 0 or very minimal scaffolding that you are providing to support the student. So really, you should be seeing a theme between intensive and extensive reading and listening. And really, the 2 skills, there are 2 passive skills, reading, taking in information with the eye, listening, taking in information with the ear. But as I mentioned earlier in the lecture when I had the help of the students, even though we refer to those as passive skills, they're not passive at all. Students are having to work so hard to build meaning. As I mentioned before, they're hearing these individual words, they're capturing these words mid-air, they're disappearing immediately, they're trying to put them together into some kind of meaning and to understand the gist. Another thing that really impacts whether or not students are successful with listening, according to research, is whether or not they have a true purpose for listening. So, and this kind of makes sense in that how can we measure success unless there's a purpose that we can measure that success by? But for intensive listening, always give your students a reason to listen, even if that reason is simply listen for the main idea, but give them a reason to listen. Any others? Another thing that we know from research, from second language acquisition research, that really makes an impact is whether or not students have any visuals to go with the listening. In other words, if you are teaching 2 sections of an intensive English class and both are focusing on listening, and you deliver a speech to your students and you videotape it and you audio tape it, if you have 1 section of students listening to the audio tape and 1 section of students listening, or watching actually and listening to the video, they're actually getting very different experiences. And if we think about what Jim Cummins in second language acquisition had to tell us about how contextualized language makes a huge difference. It is a scaffold in itself, because if all I have to go by as I'm listening to someone's language is simply the words coming at me mid-air, I can't see them, there's nothing to hold on to, that's pretty tenuous. That's kind of risky, right? But if there's also something to watch, as long as there's some kind of continuity between what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing. So, for example, as you're watching me give this, if you're indeed watching it, not just listening, you're seeing me gesture. Most of my gestures are just kind of meaningless, but you do get a sense when I gesture what it is that I'm emphasizing. So even when my gestures aren't, say, pointing at this pen, you do get a sense, a little more sense of my meaning visually. So one thing to keep in mind is if you have a choice with your students and you want to scaffold for them more, then providing video for them to watch rather than just audio for them to listen to is far more engaging. Okay, so I just want to end with, just like with reading, the key with listening, for intensive listening, is to think of it in terms of stages: pre-listening, during listening, post-listening, and to have a menu of options that kind of you keep in your back pocket and you know that you can rely on for really successful outcomes for your students. And that'll be waiting for you in the modules, my suggestions to you. So keep that in mind, and keep in mind that all 4 competencies, just as they are quite important with reading and with writing, also important with listening. So we've already talked about social linguistic competency, having a sense of what a speaker's purpose is or what they really mean by what they're saying. Grammatical competency would be, of course, having some of the key words ahead of time and having a sense of what they mean. If the thing that is going to be listened to is in, say, passive voice, so the speech is delivered like this, not a person gave the speech. The person delivered the speech, where it's subject, verb, object. But passive, where technically we don't know who did it. The speech was delivered on Tuesday. So who did the delivering? We don't actually know from the sentence. So that makes it a passive sentence. So grammatical competency, supporting students with that, would also be supporting them with having a sense of what kind of tense they're going to listen to and what does it mean, that kind of thing. And discourse is what kind of thing are they going to listen to? And how does it hang together? How is it going to begin? What does a typical middle look like? And how might it end? Giving them a sense of what to expect, or supporting discourse competence kind of in the opposite way, and that is getting them to listen and then using the text to help them notice how it works, that kind of thing. And finally, strategic. For a learner like me who really struggles with listening, it's really important that you give us some strategies. Give us something that we can use. And remember, not just with this listening text, but with every listening text we hear like it for the rest of our careers, every time we're listening in that language. So really, really important to support our strategic competency. And as I've mentioned before, when you support students with giving them strategies they can use, that is something that we are telling our students, pack this in your suitcase for the day you leave my class, because you get to take this with you. This is like something you can take with you after you leave. Okay, so I hope that this kind of rounds out what I was able to express when I gave my lecture with the generous time of the students. And I hope that you have a pretty clear sense now of some of the big things that we know from second language acquisition research about the skill of listening. Okay, move on and take a look at the texts and the videos I have waiting for you. Things that I hope will help you understand even more how the skill of listening works. And then I'll meet you in the discussion. Okay, thank you.